Let's hit it. Beautiful. Okay, thank you. So first up, I do want to thank you for joining me on whatever time zone it may be and giving up a bit of your busy Saturday to hear me talk about the excellent women of the Egyptianized Gothic. It is more like the Sahara than South London where I am, so I apologize for my halt and neck status and my slow descent into madness as I try and get through this. The morning one may have been the best one, or this one might be. It really depends. We'll see, hey? So what I'm going to do over the next hour is I'm going to provide some kind of potted biographies of some of the women that wrote the Egyptianized Gothic. I'm going to talk a little bit about their motivations behind driving, like what drove them to write these works. I am going to try and recount a couple of plots, not too many. So this is your spoiler warning. As I said this morning, I don't believe that you can spoil books that are older than 150 years old. But if you disagree with me, I'm warning you, I'm going to spoil some. Otherwise, it would just make no sense. So we're going to start us off easy, slide in a little bit. What the heck is the Egyptianized Gothic? And why am I calling it that? So first, I call this genre the Egyptianized Gothic. You may have heard of it as Egyptian Gothic, mummy fiction, imperial fiction. All of these are great terms. I use Egyptianized Gothic because this is not written by Egyptians about Egypt. This is very much a Western imagining of Egypt. It's very different. So I do like to make that differentiation as I talk, because the Egyptianized Gothic is a pain in the ass to say every single time. I will mix it up a little. We'll throw all the terms in there. And other academics do use different terms, so no problem there. Now, the Egyptianized Gothic gives agency to the darker side of Victorian ideas surrounding Egypt. It hyperfixates on not just Egypt's dominance, but also the British empires and their eventual decline. So the rise and fall of Egypt is often used as a parallel to mediate the decline and collapse of the British Empire. Now, they do differ in scope and thematic content, but I would say the starting point, more or less, is Egalise the Pharaoh's Daughter, A Story for the Ages, which is in 1884, and that's the beginning of the huge boom in this genre, which lasts up until about 1920. And in this period, there's a huge number of stories about Egyptian mummies returning to life and wreaking havoc in public spaces and private residences. Mummy fiction had existed prior to this. So the first one, which was The Mummy or A Tale of the 22nd Century, was written by teenage Jane Webb, and it was published anonymously as far back as 1827. And other popular mid-century examples of the genre include Theophile Gautier's Lapide Mummy, horrible French pronunciation, I do apologize. And that came out in 1840. And then, as we'll talk about shortly, Louisa May Alcott wrote Lost in the Pyramid or The Mummy's Curse in 1869. Now, it is from 1884 that this explosion in mummy fiction takes place, with novels and short stories appearing year after year, with an average of 2 or so a year from 1899 through to 1918. 1898 is a big year for the genre, with 5 tales coming out. But even during World War I, when there's paper rationing and people are busy, fighting a war, still 1 to 4 titles are coming out a year. It's hugely popular. And what is interesting for nerds like me is that crest of popularity maps almost directly onto the British occupation of Egypt from 1882 to 1922. Now, what I think is striking for this vogue for mummy fiction is the sheer number of stories. So when I was writing my book, I and my PhD, because the PhD and the book are pretty similar, I identified over 50 novels and short stories in a 25-year period. And to give you a bit of context on that, from 1884 to 1913, Christopher Frayling, who wrote the excellent Vampires from Lord Byron to Count Dracula, he found 14 vampire tales. In contrast, there were 41 mummy pit stories in that period. We're talking about a real craze. This is very similar to when Twilight came out and everyone went nutty for vampires, or that weird early 2000s period where everyone was writing like Pride and Prejudice and zombies. It's definitely a micro trend. So while the popularity of this has now declined a little bit outside of academic circles and myself, the stories like The Beetle did initially outsell Bram Stoker's Dracula on publication, and the Beetle was already well into its 15th edition by 1913, and it was still in print as late as 1960. I mean, it's still in print now. You can still pick up a copy, but it did fall out of print for a bit. So what's the appeal? The appeal is that the Egyptianized Gothic gives you a chance to go off limits, whether that's out of the typical Cairo tourist trap, or whether that's behind the ropes at a museum. You get to go to areas that the typical collector, explorer, tourist will not go. And these tales, they present that possibility as both tantalizing, but also horrific, a terrifying thing, because not only do these visitors touch objects and mummies, which are both subject and object, but horrifically, the mummy reaches back, it grasps them in its murderous Gothic grasp. So it's not just mummies, there's hexed objects, there's cursed plants, there's reincarnation romances. The Egyptianized Gothic comes in many guises and forms. While the peril is generally targeted at the Western middle or upper classes, the setting can be anywhere from a London street to a Cairo museum to a lost city in Africa. And protagonists, they stem from all walks of life. Nobody's safe from mummy fiction. It can be an unemployed clerk, you can be a politician, a university student, a curator, a psychic detective, and we'll get on to psychic detectives later. But really, all walks of life are here. And now, not all mummy fiction incorporates a museum, though they do pop up time and time again. I would say the space of the museum is never too far away from the home, empire, city, the marketplace. But there are some commonalities in the genre, and one is the overwhelmingly negative portrayal of the Egyptologist. They're always shown as a self-interested ghoul who deserves the curse they bring upon themselves. And mummy narratives offer alternatives to the marketplace, the trading goods, or the museum. They provide a fictional refuge for the commodification of corpses and their grave goods. And instead, they offer the mummy a chance at karmic retribution. So the mummy horror, it inverts the British Empire's desire to collect artifacts from colonial outposts and display them in a gesture of dominance. The reanimated mummy makes an example of those foolhardy enough to wish to make direct contact with history by inverting that touch. Egyptianized Gothic narratives, they show the mummy grasping, possessing, and destroying them. So instead of displaying control and power by putting mummies on display, the mummy does not choose to lie prone. Instead, they return to life. They grab back at those who've mishandled their remains. And once liberated from display, these fictional mummies are no longer an object. They're a subject, a reanimated human body. And that explains why at the conclusion of these stories, the mummy is often destroyed. The threat is neatly tied up. It's no longer a museum object, nor a vengeful subject.
You're like so fast. My God. I feel like I should still be 35 when I look in the mirror.
Now, mummies aren't just a source of horror, though what I'm about to tell you may be a source of horror. See, an Egyptologist in the Egyptian Gothic was just as likely to kiss a mummy as he was to kill it. You see, the mummy romance genre, a huge offshoot of this, uneasily merges two disparate ideals, an ancient corpse and a beautiful woman. And the Gothic elements stem from the necrophiliac connotations of this practice, but also the uncanny endurance of the female mummy, who often retains their beauty and does not appear corpse-like, at least not initially. So the mummy romance genre is characterized by this desire to enter into a sexual relationship with the mummy, which is often shown as another form of conquest over Egypt. They attempt to revive her, but at that moment of revival, she will crumble to dust, thwarting any attempts to possess her. This trope of the mummy crumbling to dust, it prevents the relationship from being consummated and, thankfully, it carefully sidesteps the necrophiliac promise inherent in these desires and these tales. So I use Eleanor Dobson's term here, sleeping beauty mummies, and that's because they tend to lie in suspended animation, waiting for the Egyptologist to attempt to awaken them. And while the initial attraction may be born from corpse fixation, if he can restore her to life, if he can awaken her, and she's not mummified, she's perfectly preserved, she looks excellent apparently, then they can shake off the trappings of necrophilia, and instead their love story takes on a romantic aspect, a fairy tale. He'll be her savior by waking her from this eternal slumber. and they can have a romantic relationship. But these, across the ages, romances, they're never successful. In fact, they offer moments of intense voyeurism in which the viewer and the Egyptologist and the reader have temporary power over the mummy. She's unable to consent. She's trapped in this limbo, and she's got no means to escape their lecherous gaze. But the moment he wants to move past sight, past gaze, and touch her, she will crumble to dust. She removes herself from existence entirely. So I believe that this is a form of defense. It is fairly active, it's not passive. And I do believe that, like a fairy tale, these Sleeping Beauty mummies offer a consequence, a lesson to be learned, because the Egyptologist has transgressed the bounds of the tomb. And the only way for this mummy to avoid consumption is destruction. So this talk, even though I've just spoken a little bit about the Egyptianized Gothic and this boon in text, it isn't just going to cover the Victorian era. While the most popular peak was that 40-year period, Egyptianized Gothic tales still pop up today. And ultimately, I do think that discomfort around the theft of artifacts and the legacy of colonialism, I mean, it's still up for debate. I often say anytime I teach any of these texts, it always derails into an argument about whether we should repatriate artifacts. And I think that's a really good thing. So this genre is primarily written by men, as arguably a lot of 19th century texts are. But when we discuss the heavy hitters of the genre, it's Arthur Conan Doyle, it's Rider Haggard, it's Bram Stoker that is mentioned first. So today I'm going to change that. I'm going to run through some different women, and I'm going to start with an early adopter of the genre, which was Louisa May Alcott, the Little Women lady. And in the exact same year, the second volume of her coming-of-age novel, Little Women, was published. Alcott also published Lost in the Pyramid or The Mummy's Curse. Now, this is a short story, and it does exactly what it says on the tin, because it's about Paul, who becomes lost in a pyramid with his colleague, who is rather on the nose, called Professor Niles. And to signal for help, they decide to make a fire in the pyramid by burning a wooden coffin. And while there, they take the mummy out, but then they decide to unroll her. And one of them has a broken leg throughout all of this. So that's what I've chalked their slightly odd behavior down to. But they find some scarlet seeds wrapped within the mummy's tomb. And then they decide that burning the sarcophagus is not enough. So they burn the mummy too. But naturally, this is going to end up in a curse. So he escapes, he's destroyed the mummy, the sarcophagus, he's kept the seeds, and he brought it home to his fiancée, Evelyn. And she wants to plant them. And he gets the creeps from them, he doesn't like them, he throws the seeds in the fire and burns them. And months pass, and it's all forgotten, and their wedding day approaches. But poor Evelyn, she's wasting away of some unknown illness. And it's revealed, she gently reveals on her wedding day, that she's grown one of the seeds in her bedroom, and it's produced this mysterious white flower, and she wants to wear it at her wedding. And you can guess where this is going, but it turns out the flower has a lethal poison which saps the vitality of the wearer, and she collapses into a coma. And this story was initially overlooked. It was only discovered in 1998, and apparently someone, I checked this, there was a question this morning and I just couldn't remember, but it was found in a collection of stories called The New World in the Washington Library of Congress. And previously it had not been attributed to Louisa May Alcott, and they realized it was one of hers in the short story collection, just forgotten about, which is very, very cool. And if you need a source for that, that would be Jasmine Day again, who is excellent. And I'm about to talk about her again. So there's a couple of interesting things about this tale. First, this piece of mummy fiction is way, way earlier than the peak of the trend. I'm talking 15 years. And also it's what Jasmine Day, who I got that information about the discovery of this tale from, argues is a proto-feminist curse tale. And that's because it creates a link between the desecration of tombs and rape. And you'll find throughout these texts, there's a sometimes subtle, sometimes heavy-handed metaphor between the desecration of tombs, tomb raiding, the destruction of tombs, and the destruction of the female body. And second, it plays on the fears of something called mummy wheat, which is a quirky bit of Victorian science where they believe that seeds found in Egyptian tombs could be viable. There's no evidence for this, but studies were carried out to see if it was possible. So The Natural History Museum have a record of one of these studies in their archives. The British Museum and the Royal Botanic Garden both attempted these with no luck. They couldn't resurrect these seeds. And there were some who claimed to have success, but these were hoaxes. They just swapped out the old seeds for new ones and were like, look, we grew some Egyptian bread. But ultimately, it wasn't real. And I love that Louisa May Alcott was obviously listening to what people were saying, reading the latest scientific texts, and then incorporating it into her short story. Now, the next author I don't have a picture of. So I'm going to do a small plea that if any Gothic historians on this call do have a photo, I would love to see it. But Kate Pritchard was born in India. She's a really interesting figure, I think. She had her son there, and then she was widowed quite early. And Kate teamed up with her son. They were clearly quite close because they decided to write horror fiction together under the pen names Ian H. Heron. In 1899, when the publisher commissioned her son, whose name is Hesketh, by the way, to explore the relatively unknown Republic of Haiti for the Daily Express, she didn't stay behind. She accompanied him as far as Jamaica. And even in her later years, she continued to travel to remote destinations, a feat that was fairly uncommon at the time. Now, she was busy, and she helped birth three incredibly popular fictional series characters. Please bear with me while I say these names because it makes me laugh every time. But there was the bandit Don Q, who was actually famous enough that at one point Douglas Fairbanks starred as him in a 1925 film. And then there's November Joe, a detective of the Canadian backwoods. But perhaps most significantly is Flaxman Lowe. And Flaxman Lowe is the first in a genre of characters known as psychic detectives. So think Sherlock Holmes, but instead of the powers of deduction, he had psychic powers. And initially, this character was serialized as a real character in Pearson's magazine, but it didn't really catch on. And eventually, they published the stories as stories in 1899. And what I'm interested in here is a story called The Story of Balebrow. And this is about a rich countryside manor that's being haunted by an unknown entity. People are being attacked by it. It's grabbing them, it's slashing them. So he goes to investigate and he interviews the people there. And they all tell slightly different stories about the thing that attacked them. One says that it has gilded nails. Another said it had no arms at all. They were tied at its sides. And he realizes they've got a home museum, and their museum has recently acquired a mummy. And logically, you would think that that means the mummy is hunting them. But oh no, it's not that simple. Instead, it's a psychic vampire, an entity that has latched onto their fear of the mummy and is feeding off their fears to attack them. So apparently the only way to resolve this threat is to kill the mummy again. And they do this by shooting it in the face several times with a revolver, which you think might do it, but it doesn't, because they club it in the face with the butt of the handgun. And then when that doesn't quite get the job done, they instead do a kind of Viking burial where they push it into water and set it on fire. And that apparently resolves the threat as long as they no longer bother it, which I find is quite an ominous and ambiguous ending. Now, it's really trite for me to use a talk about women to talk about someone's son, but I'm going to do it, and you'll see why. Because Hesketh was busy developing in World War I a method to locate enemy snipers using realistic paper mache dummy heads. Now, arguably they don't look that realistic now, but they're over 100 years old. So, and how this worked is they would put a little cigarette in the mouth and they would lift the head above the parapet. And when the sniper shot the head, they would drop it to simulate a casualty. And then they could use the periscope to look at the entry and exit points of the bullets and see how it works. You could even smoke the cigarette. There was a tube that came through. I mean, what a way to do it. So excellent invention. And of course, he did survive World War One. But Kate, she outlived him by 13 years, dying in 1935. Now, my next author was hugely popular in her day. I'm sure quite a few on this call have read her Corelli, even if it's not Ziska. She outsold Kipling, Conan Doyle, H.G. Wells, much to their umbrage, I must say. She was a best-selling author, but often critically panned. And I'm not going to name any names, but I'm sure everyone just thought of an author who is a bestseller but critically panned. So we'll leave that there. But Corelli has been largely overlooked today. And I think that's because a lot of her works contain this scientific and Christian pseudo-babble. She loves to introduce a new plot and then immediately interrupt it with some kind of diversion into reincarnation or astral projection. And I do think that impacts the readability a little bit today. And her novel, This Girl, The Problem of a Wicked Soul, is not immune to these issues. Now, it tells the story of a beautiful, ambiguously Egyptian Russian woman called Ziska Charmazel, and she bewitches the rich men living in Cairo, but particularly a painter called Armand Gervais. And he tries to paint her, but he can only paint pictures of her where she appears dead and disfigured. And this is revealed it's because they were reincarnated lovers naturally, and he murdered her in a past life. But at the end, he dies, she forgives him, and their souls are at rest. It's as close to a happy ending as you're going to get in any of these tales. Now, Ziska isn't Marie Corelli's only contribution to the lore of mummy curses. You see, after the death of the Lord Carnarvon, who did die after the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb, Corelli wrote to the New York World, claiming that she had warned him. It was Corelli who coined the phrase, "Death shall come on swift wings," to anyone who enters the tomb of the pharaoh. And she also believed that the tomb contained poisons. And when pressed for a source on this, she cited an unnamed ancient book, which I guess is like the 19th century version of trying to find something on Wikipedia. But it riled up a lot of people. Egyptologist Professor Reisner responded, "This kind of talk may be permissible in a Marie Corelli novel, but it's inexcusably silly and a serious statement to the press and must cause unnecessary pain to the family of the dead peer." So as you're beginning to learn, she's quite an eccentric figure. She was definitely a serial liar. She claimed she published her first book at 17, but she was probably 30. She also claimed to be descended from Arcangelo Corelli or the Doges of Venice. And to reinforce this, she would sail on a gondola down the River Avon in Stratford, steered by a gondolier that she hired herself and brought over from Venice. And also during World War I, she found herself quite unpopular because she was convicted of hoarding food. So generally she avoided being seen in public and she lived in fear of being photographed, which I respect. The one photograph she did take of her, the front page for the 1906 novel Treasures of Heaven, she was airbrushed to make herself look 20, which I also respect. And I think her fear was justified because when Mark Twain visited her, this is what he wrote in his diary. "She is fat and shapeless. She has a gross animal face. She dresses for 16 and awkwardly and unsuccessfully and pathetically imitates the innocent graces and witcheries of that dearest and sweetest of all ages. She also lived with a female companion who she was buried with and she left everything to when she died." Now, Corelli didn't leave any first-hand sources about her sexuality, but this does smack a little bit of the "they were just roommates" kind of trope. Now, while we're talking about eccentric authors, we're going to move on to my favorite prolific baddie and serial hater, Winifred Graham, if it will ever transfer. There we go. So Graham's career as an author began in the 1890s, and she was prolific. She wrote 88 books in her lifetime, and that doesn't even include short stories that she had published in various newspapers or magazines. And in addition to the romantic novels and thrillers that were most of her output, she also wrote a highly critical popular history of Mormonism, 2 volumes that were supposedly communicated to her by her father after he died via automatic writing. And not to be outdone by the 2 volumes from her dead father, she also wrote a 3-volume autobiography. And between 1908 and 1924, Graham led a campaign to ban Mormon missionaries from the UK. But she didn't just hate Mormons, she's an equal opportunities hater, is Winifred Graham. She also published works critical of Zionism called The Zionists, Christian Science, Christian Murderers, Catholics, Mary, original, and the women's suffrage movement, The Enemy of Woman. But what I'm interested in her for is none of this stuff, though it is all pretty wild. It's The Gods of the Dead. And it's a really unusual novel. It's quite hard to track down. There is indeed one copy that's been floating around online for 450 quid that I've been looking at my whole PhD, but I ain't paying that. And I'm probably the only person who'd ever buy it. And there's one copy in the British Library, which if I don't have it out, please go down and read it. It's excellent, a great way to while away the afternoon. But the plot involves a man who brings the mummy of a priestess home and decides to burn it to set her spirit free. And at the moment he does this, his daughter is born and she absorbs the spirit and she becomes charming and clever and wonderful and driven, and everyone's quite awed by her, including her father's employer, who she rejects a proposal for, and he responds to this in a completely normal fashion by taking her to Egypt, drugging her with an ancient Egyptian drug called bang, and essentially date raping her while she is hallucinating that they were lovers in a past life. It's quite wild. It's very implied, but I would say for the early 1900s, it is quite strong. She's quite traumatized by the experience. The book does go into that. And the gods of the dead of the title do strike this man down. He does wither away. A happy ending if you ever get one. But I do think it's a very interesting book. It's worthy of looking at, and I don't think there's a lot of critical writing on it. Next up, another author who I do not have a picture for. So I beg you, historians of the world, if you have one, please send it my way. So Henrietta Everett was greatly admired in her lifetime. She was loved by M.R. James, but she's now mostly forgotten. She wrote under a pen name, Theo Douglas, and she was unmasked in 1910. She began writing in 1896 at the age of 44. And you'll see throughout this, there's quite a theme of these women picking up a pen and writing novels. I say late in life, but 44 is not late in life. But you know what I mean? They didn't come out the womb and immediately start bushing out novels. And I think that's interesting. And even though correlation does not cause causation, I do think it's worth seeing that these people decided to come to horror fiction late in life. So in the 24-year period that she was writing, she wrote 22 books, and at least half of them were fantasy or supernatural. And the one on screen here is Iris and Mystery. This is an Egyptian Gothic classic. In it, a professor called Lavenham finds a mummy, and when he opens it, she happens to come back to life. And he does what any normal person would do in this situation. He takes her to Gretna Green and he marries her. But unfortunately for him, she's being pursued through multiple lifetimes by a sorcerer. And the necklace, which is on the cover of this book here, with those pendants, every time one falls off, she begins to wither away until she dies. Or does she? Because there's a twist at the end where it is revealed that Lavender may have been mad all along, and people say that he saw him carrying a bundle of rags and sticks and bones in wedding gear. So maybe none of this happened, and yet did it? Because his friend does discover a signature on the wedding register in Gretna Green. So there's a bit of ambiguity there. Who knows what happened? Really? Read it. Tell me. I'd love to know your thoughts. But it's great. And it really does show this obsession with human remains as the ghoulish thing it is in a very clever way. Also, these pictures make this book look massive, but it is not that long. You could definitely read it in an hour or two if you're quick, or a whole day if you're slow. It's really not as bad as that implies. They must have used massive font in those editions. But it's good. The Emergence of American Science Fiction says it's a novel on the threshold of science fiction, a strange blending of psychology and Egyptology, showing the completeness with which authors combined supernatural and scientific during the 1890s. Her other books, though not Egyptian, are fairly out there. Nemo tells of a woman who unwillingly possesses and animates an automaton, and Malevola, which is both a great name and I think will make an excellent band name. And well, Malevola is about a vampire who can only absorb beauty and life force during a massage. Because when else would you absorb it? In the 1911 census, Everett's listed as a widow who's living on private means. She dies in 1932, and in her will, she leaves £4,853, 3 shillings, 6 pence to her son Isaac, and that's around £250,000 today. So she was definitely making decent money out of this. Bear with me while I chug water. Now, my next author, I thought about not including, and then decided I absolutely couldn't, because while she is so well known, her relationship with Egypt makes it impossible to leave her out. Who else was I going to say? So she loved Egypt. She made her first trip there in 1908, when she was 19, and making the most of the 3-month winter social. She did not do any Egyptian exploring. Instead, she attended polo games and went dancing, which, I mean, she's 19. What do you expect? And then later, her writing would fund her husband's expeditions in Egypt. And in fact, their cruise to Aswan for a dig would inspire death on the Nile. Now, Egypt does pop up time and time again in her novels. Now, why I did say there'd be spoilers, I'm not a monster, so I'm not spoiling the plots of mystery novels or crime novels. That is a level of evil I'm not willing to stoop to. But there's a flash of titles up here on screen, so you get a rough vibe of what I'm talking about. She was also friends with Howard Carter, so there's another Tutankhamun connection here, who she met in Luxor and she played bridge with, apparently. Outside of hotels and cruises, Christie often describes Egypt with a Gothic edge, and she's quite melodramatic. Take, for example, her 1930s description of Egypt as frightening and fascinating, this vast world without vegetation. Apparently, she travelled with tins of flea powder, which is fleetings and flit, and carbolic soap. And then she writes, mosquitoes, flies, and then at night, the mice, the bats, cockroaches, snakes in the bedroom, desert dogs howling. Despite this, she swore survival from all of these critters was down to one good soft down pillow. It makes all the difference between comfort and misery. And I feel it, man. That sounds like me with my like weird fridgy eye mask and my earplugs. I 100% get it. So next up, I'm not meant to have favorites, but I do. 100%. And Erin M. Ely is one of them. So I'm going to do show and tell. There we go. I'm going to see if how clearly this will show up on screen. But Obelisk here opens to have an excellent cover inside. Oh, it's zooming. Love that for me. Right on the face. So you can see the spirit, the evil spirit that possesses our protagonist, Steve Harrison, in Obelisk. So Obelisk, I found out about from Grady Hendrix's excellent paperbacks from Hell. I highly recommend you get it if you haven't read it. It's a love letter to the 80s paperback horror explosion. And that is a beautiful addition. She wrote another one called Totem with a liftable cover, which we'll see a little later. Obelisk tells of Steve Harrison. He is a slightly naughty assistant at the Cairo Museum. He goes into the tomb to steal loot for himself. And while he's being a dick and stealing, he accidentally gets possessed by the spirit of Menket. And unlike many Egyptianized Gothic novels that I talk about here with their soft horror, their implied terror, this is the 80s we're talking about here. So this one's really gory. It's got a lot of evisceration, an unusually large amount of disemboweling, like more than twice. And also the rape of a pregnant woman, not implied. She's his fiance. I think that actually makes it worse in the attempt to justify it. So we've moved far beyond the tame of Victorian tales now. So I'm sure you're wondering, who is the author of the paperback from hell? Well, Erin M. Ely is the pen name of Maureen Le Fleming. Now, if my name was Maureen Le Fleming, I wouldn't have a pen name. Absolutely ridiculous. And as you can see, face card, perfect. Born in Egypt in 1929. In 1949, she was crowned Miss Egypt. She originally taught reception-age children, including those of royalty, diplomats, politicians, before working in the British Middle Eastern office in Cairo. And she meets her husband, Robert, who will be her husband, a US Marine at a sporting club. And she courts him by taking rides on his Harley. I love this. It's so cute. It'll make a great film. But their lives are upended in 1952 when the Black Saturday riots happen and her mother are forced to flee Cairo. And all of this experience in Cairo is definitely going to create a deep connection to Egyptian culture. Her experiences also feed into a lot of her literary works. I'm not sure how authentic those experiences are, but they're definitely lived experience. She moves to London, but this is a really hard time for her. It's rationing, it's smog, it's fog. It's just nothing like the Cairo that she loves, and she really hates it. She misses her fiance. They manage to reunite in London, but they just can't get into the United States. So to solve this, her fiance Robert has a great idea, and his friends, they arrange for him to appear on a TV show called Truth or Consequences. And it's televised apparently, but Maureen is a surprise contestant. She jumps out of an oversized pet milk can. And the host is really won over by this love story. He helps them sort out their legal battles. They move to Louisiana, and then they settle in California. Now, she then has a long career in Sears and Roebuck. She's one of the few female salespeople in the appliances department. And then she raises a family. And in her late 50s, she retires, and that's when she begins her third act as a writer. So she attends community college, she does some writing classes there, and then she joins some private writers' workshops with the aim of publishing romance novels. And in the 1980s, she was heavily influenced by H. Rider Haggard instead. And she read it as a teenager and she read it again. And she did not produce romance novels. Instead, Obelisk came out in 1988. Then there's Totem, which if you look up has another excellent lifting cover. I don't know who designed these covers. I would love to know. I just can't find the information. And then she continued with Evil Eye and her final novel, Star Prey, in 1992. And despite her penchant for gore, her grandchildren remember her as a really sweet grandma, taking them to the museum, baking cakes, feeding the ducks. And she died in 2012. Now, because of the excellent sort of embossed paperback covers of these books, they are surprisingly hard to track down. And when they are, they're quite expensive. Luckily, they've recently been adapted for Kindle. So if you want to just read them and read them for cheap, then please do. If you want to buy one of these and pass them on to me, I would love it. I am waiting for the moment I collect all four. But at the moment, I just possess my beautiful lifting cover Obelisk. Anyway, another author that I think probably needs no introduction, but does need introduction from a mummy perspective, because while she is synonymous with vampires and Southern Gothic, I think to pigeonhole her with this would be to overlook the Ramesses the Damned series, which is sometimes called the Mummy. It really depends. But she started the series in 1989, and there's three in the series. She finished it shortly before her death. The last one came out about 2 months before, and it's, well, I said in earlier talk that I was about 80 pages away from the end of the second one. I've already read the first and third. Today, I finished it. Finally, I have been promising to do it for months. I can now return it to the library. It was actually really good. It's the best of the three, in my opinion. Maybe that's why it took so long for the library to send it to me. Anyway, I'm not an Anne Rice hater, but I'm not a lover of her purple prose. This one was also filled with awkward moments about stiffenings underneath and flowering and all this jazz. So I do tend to recommend the comic book adaptation if you don't want to hear, if romantasy is not your jam, if you don't want to read slightly awkward 1980s soft porn, the comic book version keeps all of the drama and removes a lot of that. However, if that is your thing, I highly recommend. You'll have a great time. But what I think is interesting about these stories is that unlike vampires, the mummies are made immortal through sunlight. It's sunlight that gives them healing powers. It gives them this immortality. When they're wrapped away in the dark, they're in a state of suspended animation. When they're in the sunlight, they come back to life. In fact, there's an elixir that makes them this way. And as you get into the series, it gets more and more complicated. There's like half elixirs, half immortals, all kinds of stuff. Now, it's pretty clear to me that Anne Rice was interested in both Egyptian history and the history of Egyptomania, because the novel features mummy factories where they create mummies from modern day dead people and sell them to unsuspecting tourists. And she uses this to great effect. There's a death of a character named Henry, and in a final twist, Henry's long-standing rival and sometime lover gets the last laugh when a merchant actually attempts to sell him Henry's own mummy. Now, Publishers Weekly described this book as an uneasy marriage of romance and horror that was marinated in sentimentality, melodrama, and absurdity. And I both think that's fairly accurate and maybe not the put down they think it is. So if that's something that you're interested in, if you love a bit of melodrama and absurdity, it's definitely the book for you. Now, my final author that I'm looking at in detail, I've got next to no information on her, but I really wanted to give her some flowers, if you will, because Charlotte Bryson Taylor's In the Dwellings of the Wilderness, one of my all-time favorite Egyptianized Gothic novels, is available for free online. It's short, starts off at high action, keeps going at a good pace. The characterization is good. It's quite spooky. Really recommended it. It tells the story of a crew in the desert who have become haunted by this woman who was buried alive, and she uses vampire-like powers to drain the virality of them. And considering it was written in 1904, I think it feels fairly modern. She also wrote Nicanor, Tale of Tales, A Story of Roman Britain, which I've not read. And that's all I got. She was born in Washington, D.C. in 1880. She died in New York in 1936. If you're one of those people who like to hunt down people, please do it for me. I would love to know. So there's a few biographies, but there's so many people that we'll just never know. And that includes women who published under male aliases, women whose biographical details have been lost to time. On screen, I've left a list of some of the other female Egyptianized Gothic authors who I like their works a lot. I know a few of you read Curse of Versatis in the reading group, and that's another one that I just couldn't find any decent biographical information. And some of them are definitely pen names. We're looking at Blanche Bloch-Schleppi. There's no way that's a real person's name. I'm sorry if there is a Blanche Bloch-Schleppi on the call, but it's just not. Also another great band name, if anyone is looking for one. If you do have any information on these people, please let me know. You'll also notice there's not a lot of modern authors on this. Anne Rice is probably the exception that proves the rule. And I think that's because there's not a lot of sort of modern Egyptianized Gothic horror. So Banana Yoshimoto, Japanese author, wrote The Mummy in 2015, but I would say it's definitely more weird fiction than horror fiction. And also last year, Rachel Louise Driscoll released Nephesis, which I always pronounce wrong, but it's definitely more of a reincarnation romance, though luckily not a mummy romance. So why is this? Where are all the women writers? So I believe it's a lot to do with the afterlives of mummy fiction, which now is in cinema and the cinematic. The 1932 Mummy, the 90s Mummy series, even Scooby-Doo. They've shaped how we imagine the mummy. And the lack of women directors in general is a wormhole I don't have time to get into in a 1 hour talk. It's a lot to unpack. But I will argue that as well as that issue, mummy movies have closed the imaginative gap in how we see the mummy. We don't find them that threatening anymore. They're kind of Scooby-Doo mummies, you know, like toilet paper trailing, arms out, slowly going, not very fast, not very scary, groaning, all of that jazz. And I do think with that type of mummy dominating, there's no space for hallucinogenic Nile date rape cruises, which is probably for the best, or poisonous tomb flowers, or Egyptologist mummy marriages. We're not going to get films of mummies going to Gretna Green, but if we are, I'd like to see them. So my dream is for a cool female director to pick up one of these. If anyone wants to tackle that, please let me know. Hire me as a historical consultant. I'd love it. So to wrap up, pun intended, here's my reading list. If you want to take some forward, Louisa May Alcott is a really good overview of the genre, hits all the tropes. I think it's excellent. If you want something a bit more unusual, still elements of horror, but definitely a reincarnation romance too, Siska's there. Or if you just really love like long tangents about spirituality, that's there too. Ramesses the Damned, I'm going to be controversial and pick the Innovation Comics adaptation, but pick your poison, man. If you want wordy soft porn scenes, then the whole series is for you. If you want action and scary mummy stuff, the comic book version does a bit more of that. I'm obviously going to recommend Obelisk. I said it's hard to get hold of, but it's worth splashing out on Kindle. And Charlotte Bryson Taylor's In the Dwellings of the Wilderness, which I just typed up. It's available for free online. It's definitely on archive.org. I read it in the run-up to this talk. And finally, well, thank you for spending some time with me. I really hope, if nothing, I helped you discover an amazing new author. My book, Egyptian Gothic, is a ludicrously expensive £100 academic book. I'm always happy to send out copies to people who want to read it. I don't think knowledge should be behind a paywall. And as well as that, I've already been paid for it, and someone leaked it online. It wasn't me, by the way. But if you want to get across it by other means, I don't mind. I am open to people just reading it. So really, that's it. I've got a couple of online talks coming up. I've also got some in-person ones that I can't announce quite yet. All my socials are on screen. And that's it. Thank you very much.